Welcome back, everybody. Today I have a guide for Birgitta, the newest Ice Soul Weaver to epicseven. Let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to talk about when it comes to Birgitta is her kit and her stats. For her stats, she is pretty good. She does have the stats of one of the collab characters, Ning Ning. She's 114 base speed, has a bit of effectiveness, which makes sense because of her kit, which we'll get to in a second, but her HP and defense is not that bad as well. If we move on to her kit, she has Nothing Personnel Kit, which is one of the funniest sounding names for a skill. But this skill, interestingly, not only has bind, it also has block. Now, another really big thing about this skill is that because of the order and the way that this gets, I guess, debuffed or gets applied to the enemy, you are actually not able to cleanse the bind, which means that so long as you actually land the block here, you actually can't cleanse this. Now, again, not only is that, I guess, the block going on at the same time, but you also can't counter, you can't get dragged, you basically can't do most things outside of getting combat readiness pushed when you have the bind on, and because of the way that block works, you aren't able to be cleansed, you can't get any buffs, and all in all, you are in purgatory, basically, while that's going on. The next thing that is really cool about Birgitta is that she has a skill 2 that gives you an extra turn to the caster in addition to a 50% combat readiness push after you skill enhance, and her skill 1 is a pushback that kind of is good, ends up being a 30% or a 30% pushback, assuming that the target that you're hitting has block on them, which is kind of nice if you're trying to control a character that you've, I guess, blocked and binded, akin to someone like Navy Captain Landy and Abyssal Euphine, the list goes on. Now, in terms of the way that I think this character is going to be played, and you'll probably see a showcase of this character in a little bit, I think that Birgitta right now is somewhat of a cleave-centric, aggressive kind of centric character. Now, for RTA, the latter is kind of silly, so you'll probably see a cleave, a true unconditional cleave that tries to force Birgitta, but in most cases, she feels kind of like a Moon Bunny or a mid. And the honest truth is that although Birgitta does have this really impactful skill 3, her kit is not that synergistic with, I guess, the rest of the characters in the game right now. Although you could definitely argue that having Birgitta and Moon Bunny, or Birgitta and Sea Phantom Politis rather, would be really, really powerful because you could seal a character like, Navy Captain Landy, or you could seal the Abyssal Euphine, Aiden, etc. That does kind of come at the, I guess, with the assumption that you don't get pushed back by a Zeo, the assumption that you don't get provoked by some of these other characters. And long story short, although I do think that if you are trying to play her really, really fast and you're trying to outspeed with her, I think that she could work. It does kind of lean more towards the whaley. You need really, really good gear to make this character, I guess, viable and overpowered. On that note, though, if we want to talk about the imprints of this character, let's go into, I guess, once it loads, her imprints. Well, as you can see here for her imprints, they're pretty impactful. She has effectiveness for herself, which is really nice, but she also has an imprint release of attack percent, which is even nicer, I guess, technically speaking. If you are going to be running this character alongside characters like Sid, Spectre Tenebria, or any damage dealers, maybe even a Janua, that you want to push up, it is nice to give the attack percent to the allies that are dealing damage on your team. But in my opinion, although these imprints are kind of nice, she is a 5-star, it's not a limited, it's not a collaboration character, so the imprints do not matter, they're not mandatory. Moving along, let's talk about my personal build, and as you can see here, in the video that I had done originally, I tried her at 300 speed and had a decent amount of success, although it kind of felt like, again, it's a more cleave-centric draft, people aren't that familiar with what's going on, and I'm going to use someone like Birgitta and Sid, Birgitta and Ludwig, to kind of catch people off guard. I do think that 281, 16.5k HP so I don't get one shot, and having her own artifact is really, really nice. Hit set is likely going to be, I guess, the best in slot, but as for free gear that I have available to kind of equip to this character, this is the build that I have on her, and I think a lot of you guys that are going to try and build this character are also going to encounter the same problem. Birgitta is not so priority on most cases, or in most cases, that you would give her your tier 1 best of the best gear, unless if you're specifically trying to cleave with her. But even in that case, you would maybe want to put the gear on Birgitta on a character like Moon Bunny, who kind of does something similar. But instead of worrying about getting pushed back or something, or getting provoked by the Conqueror Lilius, since she's faster in terms of base speed, at least Moon Bunny has the ability to cleanse you if the Conqueror Lilius ends up pressing S3. Now, to be clear, again, I do think that where I think this build, the build that I have right now, shines, is going to be in more controlled settings, but we'll get to that later alongside, I think, her strengths and weaknesses. Now, in terms of best sets, I do think that you could run Birgitta as either a speed plus hit kind of character, a speed plus HP, speed plus immunity type utility, effectiveness, debuffer. But I also think that if you want to run her on counter, give her Celestine. It should be noted that, again, her S1 does provide a decent amount of pushback. And if you have Celestine and you have the cleanse on your S2 and you forcibly bind one character, that's a Navy Captain Landy that can't get hit. And if you're just trying to run her as a slow kind of answer to, characters or to solo DPS compositions that slower players or slower team comps end up running, she's kind of your girl. There aren't that many characters in the game right now that have the bind and kind of prevent you from doing anything on your turn type debuff. The only character right now that it feels really good to have or feels really good to run that with is going to be Knockwall, because she is super, super strong. And on that note, if we're comparing a character like Birgitta to Knockwall, the only difference between Knockwall and Birgitta is that Knockwall has pretty much no real super, super slow practical usage, just because if someone ends up outspeeding your Knockwall, you're not, you don't have access to something that would stop the Knockwall from getting unbuffable or from getting one shot. Whereas Birgitta, at least if you are going to get outsped by something like a Laia S2 or by a Ran S2, S3, you could argue that if you're running a slow Birgitta, you could have Celestine, you could run ER. She is a Soul Weaver, which means that she is likely going to have better stats in the Knockwall. But the point is that specifically Birgitta, if you want to run her on a slower set and have something like counter plus immunity, I could also see that working, especially if you are going to be running something like Proof or a Celestine on her. Now, in terms of artifacts, or on the topic of potential builds, let's talk about artifacts, because if you are going to be running Birgitta as a more I'm taking turn one kind of character, there is no better aggressive artifact, it feels right now, for cleave-centric Soul Weavers than something like Bird's Eye View. If you are able to give your Sid, give your Ludwig, give your whatever DPS you want the ability to get souls turn one, that's really crazy. But I do want to make mention about the fact that there isn't too much testing on it yet, but Fan of Light and Dark, aka a mid's artifact, could also be quite nice for the Birgitta team, specifically because not only do you get to increase the combat readiness of the target that you end up S3ing or you S2, S3, and you use your non-attacks with, you also give them a 70% chance to get critical hit damage for 2 turns, but that is only assuming that you have a max Fan of Light and Dark. For the majority of you players, you may have pulled for 1 or 2 copies of a mid's artifact in case if it ended up being good, but you likely don't have a max of this. So if you are okay with running the gambit of whether or not you're going to get like a 50-50 chance of getting a critical hit damage buff, that's okay. But I do want to make mention that if you do end up running this, your S2 alongside the S3, it's a 70% push, which is kind of cooking. You could kind of come up with a composition that works for her, which could be kind of interesting. But I think in general, if you want to anti-cleave or kind of do something against a lot of the cleaver type characters or cleaver type builds, the Detective's Gadget is quite nice when you remove souls from the enemy team. Like I mentioned before, the slower team composition will likely be using something like Celestine. And for all other builds, something like Proof, her own artifact, Soul Constellation to surprise people that want to outspeed you or use non-attacks before you, are all solid options. Now, in terms of being good for PvP and PvE, if you just take a look at the kit, she's got a resistible S3, and the S3, to be clear, only applies to heroes. The bind and the block both only apply to heroes. And the S1 doesn't really do anything, so all that you could kind of look for in a PvE usage for Birgitta is just her S2, and the honest truth is that a cleanse is not that impactful, specifically on S2. At best, you may be able to use her in something like a Nightmare Lab or maybe in a future Rift. We don't really know what anything's like or any of those pieces of content are going to have right now, but in general, I would say that for PvE, she's not that usable, or you would be stretching, or you could use someone else to replace her. And for the PvP, I would say that she's actually quite good in controlled environments, especially Arena and Guild War. Again, in most cases, if you're able to control the number of souls that you have, the characters that you're pushing up, the ability to soul burn and bind a character, I can imagine a lot of team compositions that just turn one, immediately bind the Janua or the slow Candy, and then you just have the other character, whether that's a Fire Politis, an Architect Leica, whatever the character is, kind of just clean up and finish the rest of the team. But I do want to kind of mention that in terms of you cycling, or in terms of you setting things up, keep in mind that you only get 15 souls if you are at plus 15 with Birgitta. And if you want her artifact to give you the max amount of souls, or the equivalent to owning a Tag of Hell's book on this character, you gain 1 soul on your subterfuge, which means that you actually need to get this artifact to 24 if you want the equivalent of a Tag of Hell's book after you use Birgitta's S2. Otherwise, you don't actually gain access to quite enough souls. You do gain 3 souls if you do end up using her S3, if that's something that's up your alley. But long story short, I think that she's decent in Guild War. She's decent in Arena, especially against teams that you can kind of manipulate and you could force them to hit certain targets. But for RTA, I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult, specifically because, again, if you're not running her pretty fast, you have to essentially guaranteed be fighting against a team that has no chance for going fast, and they're only spamming basically characters like Navy Captain Landy, and they're running a more protect the one individual comp, or protect the one DPS kind of compositions, which is not as common as it used to be, but maybe a little bit more common because of the way that the third pick ban protection is, I guess, changing the way the RTA works. So that's the PvP and PvE section. Now, in terms of synergies and counters, I do think that you're going to hear this for basically the next year or like 2 years. Sea Phantom Politis is a terrific combination alongside the Birgitta. In some cases, you may end up fighting something like Candy and Abyssal Euphine when you're using the Sea Phantom Politis. And what better way to stop all of these characters from, you know, I guess countering into you than to have the Birgitta bind and block them at the same time. Now, typically when you do have the Sea Phantom Politis, you pair her, or you pair the Sea Phantom Politis with a character like Ambitious Tywin, which is really nice because of his rage activation and then his skill 3. But in general, you may need a little bit more oomph, and sometimes you want to prevent yourself from getting one shot by something like Navy Captain Landy, which could definitely happen. And in this case, again, if you even want to pair someone like Birgitta with the Navy, pair Birgitta with the Ambitious Tywin, not only do you get to push up the Ambitious Tywin or cycle whoever you end up pushing with your S2, you are forcing the one character that's been bound and blocked to just not exist. And in that case, you're kind of happy, because something that I've seen a couple times, or happened a couple times, is that when the Ambitious Tywin S3s into the Navy Captain Landy, guess what? She counters, she salvos, she knocks whatever character you thought you were going to be safe with out of stealth, and then it's all over. But now with the Birgitta, now you get to bind and block the character. And of course, that is going to be one of the characters that I think she synergizes well with. That being said, though, I also think that if you're going to run someone like Conqueror Lilius, this could also work. Conqueror Lilius, infamous for always being good at taking turn 1 and pairing basically any aggressive DPS alongside her. Birgitta sets up another DPS, because not only do you now get the Conqueror Lilius Vigor and the Provoke, now technically speaking, you can also bind one of the characters. So if you want to, say, S3 with Conqueror Lilius, provoke the Aiden, Birgitta bind the Navy Captain Landy, well, now you're kind of in for a good time. You can kill whoever you want with your Sid. You can kill whoever you want with whatever DPS you have. The Conqueror Lilius can be paired with Spectre Tenebria, your own Abyssal Euphine, whoever it is, and you have no real issue while trying to pair them together. I think that's likely going to be one of the strongest compositions that I'll see for beginner players when they're likely trying to beat Guild War and things of this nature, just because you could take Spectre Tenebria, have Book, and it's suddenly GG. But outside of the synergies, I do think that her biggest counters are also going to likely be her biggest synergies. If she's outsped, she basically doesn't do anything. And as a result, if you do have characters like Sea Phantom Politis on deck who can outspeed the Birgitta, if you end up having someone like Zio to S3 and silence the Birgitta, these are all really bad things. And just in general, being reset as a fast, or as a character that needs to go fast, is terrible and not ideal. But that is kind of just something that comes with the territory. personally right now, I think you could almost argue that a similar thing is going on with characters like top model Luluka, or even characters that are in the mid-speed range akin to, you know, the, I guess like the knock walls, the Laya, maybe not Laya, but like the knock walls and like the last piece Karens and the Gala Liliuses of the world. Now, again, if you are reset by these characters like Knockwall or, you know, Sea Phantom Politis, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're bad, but rather that the draft requires a slower composition to make work, which is why I think that although she does have a lot of counters in terms of being outsped, her real counters, or Brigitta's real counters, are going to be characters that force you to press or be in a bad position no matter what in your ideal scenario. And I think in those cases, it's going to be, or her true counters are going to be characters like Celine, who's definitely crept up in viability right now, and also characters like Politis. Sometimes you don't want to touch the Celine. Sometimes you don't want to have to think about how to maneuver around the Celine. Sometimes you don't want to have to do the same for Politis. And because of that, and especially if you're having to bind or block a character like Politis when Navy Captain Landy or Aiden's around, it kind of just makes more sense for you to just sit there and not pick her at all. And that's kind of the reason why right now I think characters like Knockwall and characters like Zio are so strong. It's because with the prominence and the buff of Celine and the prominence of characters like Politis and doing so much damage, you need characters that don't activate any trip mines or land mines, and they actually unbuffable, or they bind, or they prevent you from countering. And that's why I think Birgitta is definitely balanced, although I don't think anyone would say she's broken, mostly because she definitely has prominent counters that are very strong in RTA. And of course, if you take a look at the arena as well, you could definitely see that there are plenty of counters that exist even in arena. You see Zio, you see Bellion. Sometimes these are going to be high effectiveness or high effect resistance characters, and in that case, I wouldn't even be able to bind one of these characters. For this team, I kind of want to bind every single character, bind and block every single character with my Birgitta here. Do I want to bind the Aiden? Do I want to get unbuffable by the Angel of Light? All these things are kind of troublesome, and I think that in most cases, as is kind of the intention and what they showed in the showcase, Birgitta is a character that definitely wants to be encountering only single DPS threat or singular threat teams alongside supports that aren't able to cleanse them. Moving along though, we inevitably have to answer the question, is she a must pull? And as I have already stated in my earlier kind of video showcasing a fast Birgitta, she absolutely is not. This is not a must pull character by any means. If you want to pull for one copy of her and her artifact, that's fine. However, I don't think that most people are actually going to be able to use Birgitta or her artifact the way that they actually want to. Birgitta and her artifact are both semi-leaning towards RTA, and although you could definitely argue that something like Moon Bunny giving souls to a Sid is really nice, in most cases, if you're running Moon Bunny plus Sid, you could also just take Spectre Tenebria in like a Guild War or in an arena setting and then just kill the team composition anyways. It doesn't really matter that much. So I think that in that case, having her be a must pull for these fringe cases is mostly locked behind RTA, and even in that case, I think you're going to have some really good gear to make her work. So therefore, I don't think she's a must pull. And although I'd love to show you guys the highlights and strengths and weaknesses of this right now, all I can kind of tell right now from my testing with her is that if you end up outspeeding, I mean, she pushes up a character up 50%, gives them souls, and if you're able to kill with the Sid, which most of the time Sid with Soulburn can kill anything in the game, but assuming that that condition is met, or if you are able to actually bind a character here with S3 and either push up the Ludwig because you Soulburned, or again, push up the Sid with your S2, these are fine. But I think that her major strengths are basically surprising people as of right now, especially before we develop a full cleave composition with her. Excuse me. But her main weaknesses are whether or not you're confident in your speed, and that's kind of the issue with a lot of characters like this. Unlike with a character like Sea Phantom Politis, who you could maybe build effect resistance, you can give yourself guide to a decision so that you can't get, you know, knocked out of stealth by something ridiculous like a Ran S3, whatever the case is. It does feel like Birgitta right now is primarily focused on faster players, or faster players gain the most from playing Birgitta, and everyone else is kind of just using her for fun in arena if you really like her, or in a guild war because she's your waifu. And that's totally fine, but ultimately, guys, at the end of it all, I think that this character is cool, is fun, but not OP, not broken. In any case, though, guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. Let me know what you think about Birgitta, if you think she's good, if she's bad. In any case, I will have these showcase up sooner rather than later. But thanks again for watching, everyone. If you guys are interested in this sort of content, feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Make sure to check out my main channel, where I'll probably have the main showcase for Birgitta. But this is going to be primarily, I think, the guides channel now, or where I post a lot of the guides and my thoughts about the characters as they come out. Thank you again for watching, though. Make sure to check out all the rest of my socials and the rest of my content, especially on this channel. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.